Okay, Gary, thank you, and thank you for having me today. Boy, it's hard to see up here, these bright lights. Thank you, Leadership Conference, for inviting me to be here today. Thank you, Mr. Anton, and what a great turnout. This is the heart of the conservative movement in Pennsylvania. I want to thank you personally for the help you've given me over the years and for your efforts in this past election, where because of you and your efforts, for the first time since 1988, Pennsylvania went for the Republican for president. Not only that, you kept our friend Pat Toomey in the Senate and holding on to that slim lead of 52 to 48, which is critical to advance conservative principles. Recall for a moment with me how you felt in the early morning hours of November 9th, where we were watching the returns come in and becoming increasingly excited, and to see that it was Pennsylvania, the keystone state, that actually turned the tide for the Trump campaign. So to everybody in this room, all the hard work that you put in, it's good to see those results come through. And how did it happen? I was having a conversation this past weekend with a woman who was just reflecting on that night. How did this happen? It happened because people were hungry for change. They were tired of the stagnant status quo, and they saw that this country could be in a much better situation. In the House, we hit a little road bump last week as we seek to return power to the people. But as you reflect on last week, consider this. What would we have been doing if Donald Trump were not president, but Hillary Clinton were? And that gives us a little kind of context in which to be looking at things. Would we be even discussing health care reform, or tax reform, or regulatory reform, or strengthening our defenses, mindful of what's going on with Korea and Iran and radical Islamic terrorism, if Hillary Clinton were president? We'd be looking at her nominee for the Supreme Court. I don't think there'd be any threats to filibuster there. On this point, Senator Toomey talked about what's been going on in the Senate. And reflect for a moment on how Tom Price was confirmed. I consider Tom a friend and probably one of the best qualified people to serve as HHS Secretary. When President Obama nominated Sylvia Burwell to be Secretary of Health and Human Services during his second term at the beginning of 2013, this was in the throes of the implementation of Obamacare and it being very controversial. Sylvia Burwell was confirmed 78 to 15. And here comes along Tom Price, again, probably one of the most qualified persons to be HHS Secretary, party line vote 52 to 48. I think that speaks volumes of our opponents across the aisle. Today, our country stands on a fulcrum of history. Either we're going to rely on the foundational principles in our founding documents, or we're going to continue to let the progressives try to build their freedom-robbing utopia and all that it brings with it. Understand, progressives today are threatening the two main pillars of our founding: the concepts of God-given, inalienable rights that no state can take away. This is part of the fabric of our country. It's something that Abraham Lincoln fought for when he talked about the transcendence of the principles of our Declaration of Independence, not applying at one time, not applying to one group, but being transcendent and universal at all times for all people. And even President Kennedy recognized this in his inaugural address, where he reminded us that our rights do not come from the generosity of the state, they come from the hand of God. The other principle of our founding is that sovereignty does not rest in Washington, D.C. It does not rest in the government. It does not rest in a monarch or a parliament, a president or a Congress. The sovereignty rests in the people, subject to the reservation of those God-given rights that we know about. But we see these principles under attack from a regulatory superstate. It's one of the areas, actually, that we've been able to make some progress in since President Trump came in. One or both houses of Congress have already taken action under the Congressional Review Act with respect to no less than 14 Obama-era regulations that in one way or the other were detrimental to economic growth or freedom. The President has already signed several of these, including one that blocked an Obama-era regulation that has been described as a dagger aimed at the heart of the coal industry. The day the President signed that bill, a brand new coal mine was announced in my district that will result in 70 to 100 family-sustaining jobs, not counting the multiplier effect. We're going to continue to work to return sovereignty to the people, including with initiatives such as the very elegant and simple REINS Act, which simply stands for this. If any of these agencies puts out a regulation that's going to cost more than $100 million on this economy, we believe that you should have a say in that through your elected representatives. This goes to the heart of what self-rule is all about. You see, you can hold your elected representatives accountable, but you cannot do that with an unelected bureaucrat. When your representatives pass on laws and vote for laws, they're representing you, and you get to change them if you don't like what they're doing. You can't change those bureaucrats, however, so we need to return that power to the people, return it to the Congress away from the executive branch, because it's in the Congress where government of the people, by the people, and for the people is happening. But the progressives don't want to give the people that control, simply because they don't trust the people. They do not think the people are smart enough to govern themselves. Remember Jonathan Gruber, one of the architects of Obamacare, talking about what he called the stupidity of the American people and how lack of transparency was their friend in getting the Affordable Care Act passed. This is not new. Ronald Reagan talked of these folks in his inaugural address back in 1981. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. Well, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else? This vision has played itself out. This progressive vision has played itself out in so many ways over the last 8 years, whether it's healthcare, financial services, energy, or education. In each area, they have sought to grow government exponentially, it seems, and the results have been the same. Broken promises, higher costs, less choice, threats of scarcity. You know, we're in the throes of a debate about health care right now. And sometimes you wonder where we're headed. And some of the architects of Obamacare dreamed of a single-payer system, socialized medicine, national health care. You know, last fall, a survey was done. You know, they talk about how great the Canadian system is. CTV reports that a survey by the Fraser Institute last fall found a median wait time of 20 weeks for medically necessary treatments and procedures in 2016, the longest recorded wait time since the think tank began tracking wait times. That's more than double the wait times reported in 1993. I hope we're not headed there. Moving forward with healthcare, we're going to continue to work to move away from Washington mandates that have created the problems towards flexibility and choice. So the fruit of the last 8 years, stagnant economic growth, stagnant wages, rising premiums and deductibles, lost doctors and healthcare plans, restricted credit access, lost jobs. But who's benefited? Clearly, those in Washington, D.C., a city of bureaucrats, construction cranes, the top 4 richest counties in the country, Indeed, 9 of the 20 richest counties are around Washington, D.C. This is at the heart of what President Trump talked about in his campaign and his inaugural address. For too long, he said, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of a government while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share its wealth. Who's not benefited? In western Pennsylvania, it's the struggling small business that employs 30 people and can't get a loan. It's the family who had seen their insurance costs skyrocket. The mom now paying $10 a month for free checking, or $10 a month for a checking account when it used to be free. You know, $10 a month might not sound like much to a bureaucrat in Washington, but for the person who's living paycheck to paycheck, it is. Employees and students at Cambria Rao Business College in Johnstown, which existed for 125 years, but finally succumbed to Obama-era education regulations. We all know about the coal miners, the railroad workers, the truckers, community banks that have merged or closed, or small bureaus that have seen the last branch they had open, and on and on and on. This is the change we seek in Washington, to empower the American people and not the American bureaucrat. And while we work in Washington to return power to the people, we have to ask the same questions in Harrisburg. This Commonwealth has to grow again. I was very concerned when I saw a statistic last week where we saw some population loss in the Pittsburgh region. You know, if we expect to meet the challenges ahead, we've got to be growing again. We've got to have policies out of Harrisburg that are going to attract people to Pennsylvania, attract people to western Pennsylvania. That's how we're going to be able to overcome the critical challenges we have. One last thing, I just want to mention this. I haven't really talked about this issue at all, but it's in the news all the time, Russia. You know, last decade, there was a group called Bowling for Soup. My kids would listen to it, and they had a song called 1985. It's a nostalgia-tinged song, talking about stuff from the 1980s and a little reminiscence and what's happening now. And there's a line in there, when did Motley Crue become classic rock? When did Ozzy become an actor? Well, we might want to add a new line today. When did the liberal Democrats become anti-Russian? Does anyone seriously believe that Putin would have preferred Trump to Hillary? No. And that's laughable. Have they been so blinded by their adoration of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton that they totally missed the 8 years of the Obama-Clinton reset that left Russia stronger and more influential than when Barack Obama first became president? Go through the history. The reset button, which was really just an act of appeasement that was offered only months after Russia invaded Georgia. Canceling missile defenses in Poland and the Czech Republic. President Obama suggesting a compromise on our missile defense that got caught on a hot mic in 2012, right before the election. Listen to this. The president was recorded saying this, quote, "On all these issues, but particularly missile defense, this can be solved. But it's important for him," president meaning president's talking about Vladimir Putin, "it's important for him to give me space." Then Russian President Medvedev says, "Yeah, I understand. I understand your message about space. Space for you." President Obama affirms, "This is my last election. After my election, I have more flexibility." Medvedev comes back, "I understand. I will transmit this information to Vladimir. I stand with you." This type of weakness invited aggression in Crimea, international INF, intermediate nuclear treaty violations, the problems in the eastern Ukraine. Think about the plane, the Malaysian plane that went down, shot down by a missile supplied to the rebels by Russia. Contrast that and Susan Rice's conduct as UN ambassador, which barely heard a peep. Compare that with Jeane Kirkpatrick and how she really laid it out with what the Russians had done with PLC2017. Yeah, and then we have Syria, pulling back from the Middle East, letting Russia to come into the Middle East and have influence that they have not seen in decades. It's this week, and Victor Davis Hanson writes in National Review, unlike Trump, a Hillary Clinton administration would probably have kept the radical Obama defense cuts and perpetuated the restrictions on domestic energy development that were helping Russia. She probably would have likewise continued Obama's therapeutic approach to foreign policy. From Russia's point of view, Hansen concludes, considering their strategic and economic interests, a pliable Obama 2.0 would have been far better than Trump, with his pro-oil and gas domestic agenda, his promised defense buildup, and his unpredictable Jacksonian promises to help friends and hurt enemies. Seriously, when, to paraphrase Bowling for Soup, did liberal Democrats become anti-Russian? As I wrap up, again, I want to encourage you to stay engaged. We are in the fight for the future of this country. We are literally on that fulcrum, and we have two paths to choose from. Let's go back to high school. Let's go back to Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. We know where the path of well-worn big government will lead us. More costs, more taxes, less choice, scarcity, less pursuit of happiness. Let us instead venture on that path of freedom. That will make all the difference. Thank you. God bless you and your work. Let's continue to make America great again.